We've been looking at a lot of Seiko watches on the channel recently. I was almost going to change the channel name to Addicted to Seiko. Okay, maybe not. But there's a good reason for that. They offer good value at the budget end of the market and have a consistent, well-developed design language. But there are other brands in that market too, and this watch might just be better value than any Seiko watch available today. Welcome to Addicted to Seiko, watches. Today, we'll be looking at a watch that I've been looking at and wanting for quite a long time, but never got around to getting one, until now. It's quite famous already, so it's not exactly a hidden gem in Orient's catalogue, but it's probably a bit less popular in this colorway compared to the white version. It packs a lot into a very affordable package. This is the Orient WV0011TX, better known as the Neo 70s Solar Chronograph. The version you might already be familiar with is the White Panda version. It's a popular one for a reason. The term panda, when it comes to watches, generally refers to a chronograph with a white dial and black subdials, like a panda's eyes. You can probably guess, then, what a reverse panda is. These designs are generally pretty popular on any watch. The Orient in that version is a very striking watch, and, to be completely honest, before I bought this one, I didn't even know there was another version. What drew me to this one, however, was the brushed grey dial and how it plays with the light. We'll take a look at that a bit more closely later though. I mentioned in the intro about the budget end of the market. As it seems with everything else these days, the prices of watches are only going in one direction. It seems like every 6 months, brands are announcing 6 to 15% increases to their RRPs because of inflation. Seiko is guilty of this too. We've seen their prices steadily rising for years as they've gained more and more popularity in both the enthusiast and general consumer market. That makes brands like Orient all the more important, as they essentially become what Seiko used to represent, a budget Japanese brand that can offer good quality, well-designed watches at reasonable prices. At the time of making this video, I saw this particular model available on Amazon for $135 US. That doesn't get you very far with Seiko these days, but here it gets you a very attractive design, solid stainless steel bracelet, chronograph movement, solar functionality, and a big Japanese brand name on the dial. I don't know about you, but that seems pretty good to me. That's all well and good to say myself, but how about we let the watch do the talking and take a closer look. The dial has a lot going on. There's a lot of depth created by the chapter ring, hour markers, subdials, and date complication. Starting with those subdials, we can see when we look from this distance, they actually have a slight purplish hue to them. That's because these subdials are actually the solar cells that collect light to power the watch. They are slightly recessed from the dial and surrounded by slim polished bevels to really help them stand out and pop. Because they're slightly transparent, in certain lights there is a shadow created, which gives an even greater sense of depth. In terms of their function, we have a running seconds of the watch at 9, a somewhat redundant 24-hour hand at 3, and finally at 6 we have the chronograph minutes hand. We'll come back to the rest of the hands in a second, but for now, if we look at the markers, they're actually set into the raised white chapter ring circling the dial. Because of that, they appear to float above the rest of the dial again, creating visual depth. They're polished rectangular beveled indices that catch the light nicely and look good on the watch. One thing that confused me a bit though, is that those white sections running down the center of each marker are not lume. Instead, we have small dots of lume sitting just inside of the markers on the dial. A couple are lost due to the subdials, and I'm not exactly sure why Orient went this way. It wasn't something I really noticed or paid attention to at first, but on closer inspection, I'm just left wondering why. Outside of the white ring, holding the markers is a grey angled chapter ring with a minute track and each 5 minutes marked in Arabics. I'm sure you're tired of me saying this by this point, but the angle of the chapter ring once again contributes to the sense of depth you get from the dial. Even with all of that going on, Orient still found room for a date complication that sits at about 440. It's honestly not that obtrusive because most of the time it's in shadow and blends in pretty well with the grey of the dial. Speaking of the grey of the dial, All of this is set against a backdrop of brushed metallic goodness. I'm a bit of a sucker for a grey dial, which comes back to my Seiko 5 SNXS079. This one, because of the vertical brush texture, changes dramatically from a dark charcoal grey to brilliant silver in different lights. You should know by now that I'm a big fan of interesting and textured dials, so this one really grabbed me. On that dial above the pinion is an applied Orient logo, as well as the brand name printed in white. Beneath that is chronograph in a cursive script and 10 bar, the water resistance of the watch. I've heard some people question whether the Orient logo on these watches is actually applied or just pressed from the dial. I can say with a fair degree of certainty that it's applied. How, you might ask? Well, back when I was living in Japan, on a particularly rowdy night out on the town, I was wearing my Orient Ray 2. Having had some refreshments, I managed to knock the watch against something, which caused the applied logo to come off from the dial. You won't get that from a pressed logo. Back on the watch anyway, let's revisit the hands. They've got quite an interesting design. They're mostly rectangular in shape, with a bevel running down the middle. But they are partially skeletonized, with lume just on the outermost half. Not only that though, they have counterbalances. Usually, you see that on second hands, but not hour or minute hands. Those counterbalances, like the hour markers, have a white strip running down the middle, which is not loomed. The chronograph second hand is just a needle hand, and all are polished. Covering these is a dead flat piece of mineral crystal. It does pretty well for itself when it comes to reflections, even though I don't think it has any kind of anti-reflective coating applied to it. It also has a nice bevel to its edge where it meets the case, and, as I turn it, we can see that it sits just proud of the bezel, so be careful around doorknobs. Now we come to the case, so let's get the dimensions out of the way first of all. In terms of case diameter, it's not insubstantial, coming in at 42mm. Maybe slightly bigger than I generally prefer, but for a chronograph watch it doesn't look out of place. Thanks to the quartz movement inside, the height of the watch is kept down to 11.7mm, and lug to lug is also manageable at 48.5. Considering the 42mm case size, that lug to lug is not too bad, and means the watch can sit fairly well even on smaller sized wrists. The width between the lugs is 22mm, which is fine. It's more or less in proportion with the rest of the watch. The design and finishing of the case is relatively simple, but well done. It's what you'd expect from a budget watch. Around the dial is a polished bezel that catches and plays with the light nicely. It's quite slim, which I appreciate, as I wouldn't want it to be any bigger than it is. The top surface of the case is very flat and radially brushed, while the sides, also flat, are polished. The side of the case is just one smooth continuous line from lug to lug, which results in a very streamlined looking case. Thankfully, those lugs also turn down a bit as they leave the case, which helps the watch to wear well and not feel so big. The case kind of reminds me of the shape of some skin divers or a 62 mass with pointier lugs. Not that that's bad in any way. Though simple, the finishing is well done. Turning the watch to the side, we get a look at a signed crown, something you definitely won't be getting Seiko anywhere near this price point. If you look really closely, you can see it's actually lightly engraved, and not just etched into the surface of the metal. On either side of that is a pusher, used to start, stop, and reset the chronograph function of the movement. None of these screw down, but looking a bit further around, we can see that the caseback does. That gives the watch a perfectly adequate 100 meters of water resistance to handle pretty much anything you can throw at it. The caseback is simple but well done. In my opinion, the caseback doesn't need to be anything special, but this here with the brand logo and some basic information about the watch is perfect. Underneath the logo, we see another indication of the movement, light charge. So, let's talk about it. The movement powering the watch is labelled as a KBS00, but it turns out there's actually a V175 movement made by Seiko. That's not so surprising when you consider that both brands are part of the Epson group. It's a solid movement though, accurate to plus or minus 15 seconds per month, and runs for 6 months on a full charge. While not a mecha quartz, if I start the chronograph with the top pusher, you can see that the second hand ticks 3 times per second, not just 1, thanks to the 3-step motor. I had gotten used to the instant snapback when resetting other watches with the mecha quartz movement, so This one slowly spinning back to 12 is somehow both oddly satisfying and irritating at the same time. With the register at 6, this chronograph can run for up to 60 minutes. The final piece of the puzzle is the bracelet. It's not bad by any means, but does suffer from the same issues as the one on my Ray 2. Hollow end links and a pressed clasp. I can't do much about the end links, but I have replaced the clasp with this milled one, and it improves the wearing experience a lot. The links themselves are pretty standard. 3-piece, brushed, solid, and well finished for the price. The sides are polished to match the case, and overall, with the upgraded clasp, the bracelet is pretty comfortable to wear. It tapers from 22 at the case to 18 at the clasp, which is just about right for what I'd want. Now, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. At 42mm, it's a little bit bigger than a lot of other watches I've been wearing recently, but I think it manages its size pretty well. The fact that it's a chronograph and not just a simple 3-hander probably also helps it get away with this size. But it is also thanks to the dimensions of the case. It being not very thick helps it sit close to the wrist, and the curve of the lugs also helps with that too. As I turn my wrist, you can see the bezel as well as the polished rings surrounding the subdials catch the light. Not to mention those polished hour markers as well. But they all pale in comparison to the brushed grey dial, as it changes from that dark charcoal colour to brilliant silver when the light hits it right. Thanks to those skeletonized hands, it's not the most legible watch, but it's not terrible either. You won't need to squint too hard at this one to get a read of the time. Taking it off the bracelet and onto a brown leather strap, I think the watch looks fantastic. On bracelet, together with the dial, the watch feels very grey and silver, but on leather we get a really nice contrast between the warm brown tones and the cool grey ones. Popping it on a NATO strap looks equally good, and the very neutral colours on the dial mean that if you want to, you can really play around with the colours of the strap. The fact it's under 12mm thick also helps here, because even with the NATO strap, it doesn't feel too tall or awkward. So, what do I think about the watch? Well, like I said, Orient packs a lot of value into a watch with a very affordable price tag here. I think the design of the watch is very striking, and clearly a big draw for not just myself, but a lot of others too, especially in white. I don't think there is any element of the watch that really lets it down in a big way. Sure, solid end links would be nice, but they are secure and don't rattle, and the clasp isn't great, but is easily replaced. So long as you aren't a mechanical snob, which you can't really afford to be at this end of the market, and you have a wrist at least bigger than the smallest wrist sizes, I think that this watch makes a great addition to any collection. What do you think about this watch? Would you pick this one or the white version? Did you even know there was a grey version? Have you got one in your collection already? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.